As we mentioned earlier, in his continuing efforts to eliminate poverty with innovation, Yunus has established an international network of social business hubs at more than 40 universities around the world. The first Canadian Yunus Centre is at HEC, the business school at the University of Montreal. Its director is Luciano Barin Cruz. He spoke to us from Montreal. First, can you explain to me exactly what a social business is from a business school perspective?
What is important for us is that it is an organization that will try to achieve a social mission, have a social impact, and most of the time we will use products and services and have a kind of a commercial activity to achieve this goal.
What's the difference then? Because most Canadians would be familiar with, for example, a nonprofit organization. So what's the difference between a nonprofit and a social business?
We have NGOs, we have traditional enterprises, and we have cooperatives. All those kinds of organizations, they can have a social impact or a social mission. So this, I would say, is the main difference considering or comparing to what Professor Yunus proposes. He proposes that we should have a kind of a very specific legal form, which would be called the social business. And in this legal form, what would happen is that an organization would operate as a traditional business, have services, have products, but at the end, when we generate profits and the dividends will not be distributed. It will be reinvested actually for the benefit of the social mission and for scaling the social impact of this organization.
What attracts you to this idea?
What is important is the idea of trying to changing a little bit the capitalist system. We're not talking about changing it completely. We know that we are also using the capitalist system by using those ideas. So we are still talking about selling products, selling services. But what we are trying to achieve here is to come back to this idea that organizations, that they can do more than just maximizing profit, that actually they can try to combine a social mission with a kind of a business idea or a business model that can sustain itself financially. So this is what I think it's interesting here, is to give this notion that organizations, they can do more than just profit maximization, and they can try to put all their efforts and core competences to eventually try to solve a social problem, a social issue that is important in any kind of society, and at the same time have a business model that allows them to not depend always on government funding or any kind of charity, so they can sustain themselves financially.
Tell me what kind of traction you think this actually has in Canada itself, because obviously this is something that would not just apply in underdeveloped countries. It's something that could perhaps be put to use in disadvantaged communities here as well. Where do you think it would be most effective in Canada?
What we are trying to achieve, at least here in Montreal with our center, is to try to put together those different forms of organization to work around the idea of social impact. I think this is the most important message, is to try to create a kind of ecosystem for social impact. So, I mean, of course, we have the idea of a social enterprise, but I mean, what we should try to do eventually is to have all those NGOs, these cooperatives, these traditional organizations, and put them to work together to try to solve social issues that we face in society, and eventually have it and develop it in a business form that is sustained.
You also say that basically big business has to play a part here. How does big business have to step up in your view?
Yeah, so we have several examples in other countries of companies that they are trying to develop those kind of social businesses in parallel to their main activities. And the main idea is always the same. So what they do is they take their core business, their core activity, and they try to see what kinds of social problems or social issues we have in this particular society in which I operate that could be solved based on a business idea in which I have a core competence to apply. So it's always the same. This is the famous example of Grameen Danone and the yogurt that they developed, for instance, in Bangladesh, in which they try to develop a product with a more nutritious characteristics actually to sell in this kind of context. one of the things that we try to promote here in our business school through our center is this idea of trying to create more and more what we call those hybrid value chains. So instead of just thinking in terms of the traditional value chain that a traditional organization can have and working alone, how these organizations trying to tackle social issues could try to integrate more social-oriented organizations, work with them to try to innovate and have more social impact.
Do you think government is on side with this? I mean, there are regulations and there's sort of a regulatory framework around how our economy basically works around conventional business. We've mentioned nonprofits and charitables and NGOs. Does there need to be some kind of framework with a sort of a broader recognition that would enable social business to thrive here?
We know that it's already very hard to create a traditional organization. When we say creating a socially oriented organization, it can be even more difficult. So if we don't have a legal form or a kind of legal organizational format for that with the incentives that it could come together, of course, it's a challenge. Or a bigger challenge, I would say, for all those that want to have a social impact. So I think that the role of the government in this case would be eventually to try to create the rules eventually to have a kind of a specific legal format for that with incentives that would allow actually our students or anyone in Canada that want to create a organization, an enterprise, but with a social mission to have the right incentives to go through the first phases of development of this organization and have more chances to be successful.
Thank you very much for your insight on this.
Okay, thank you.